Hello, and welcome to part one. The book that I am talking about, Relevant Revelation, is structured in such a way that I think it would be helpful to start us off talking about how it's structured. One of the themes that I look at in Israel's history is that Israel's history and the stages of that history mirror the life stages of a human. In other words, when you look at Israel's history over the course of the Old Testament, you see Israel has a conception, it has a birth, it has an infancy, it has a childhood, it has an adulthood, it ceases to exist, it has a death, and it also has an afterlife. And so when you see that, as we read and study the parts of the Bible that highlight those stages, I wanted you to know that's where we're going. Chapter 1 in Genesis is the conception of mankind, and of course also of Israel. When we look and think about the creation story of chapter 1 in Genesis, it's 7 days of creation. We're introduced to God. That is the point of that story, is to help us understand that God provides for us and protects us. He's the almighty creator. And so when we are faced with the creation of all things that we are aware of, and those are things, many things we're not aware of or really cannot even fathom, we are faced with the mystery that is God. And the first chapter of Genesis has information in it that leaves us with a lot of questions. It reminds me, in a sense, of conception, because at a cellular level, a human being is formed. I can hardly wrap my mind around that. I understand it. I have read books, and I've been taught that a cellular piece of my husband and a cellular piece of me came together to form my children, but it still is a miracle to consider that there was simply a cell, and now 18 years later it has turned into my son, and 16 years later it's turned into my other son. So I still cannot fully wrap my mind around that. I can only say that a God that is introducing himself to his people was trying to help his children understand where the world began, and that is chapter 1 of Genesis. It is remarkable to consider that he is the almighty creator, and yet he sets up man to rule the world. That was his choice. Didn't have to do that, and you could argue that man is not worthy to do that, but that is the way he set up the world. Some things to consider, that when we read the 7 days of creation and start looking for themes and patterns, if you'll notice, the first 3 days we're introduced to him creating light. We're introduced to him creating water and sky, and on the third day, land. And then the fourth, fifth, and sixth day follows that pattern again, because we have the creation of light on day 1, and we have the creation of the sun and the moon on day 4. We have the creation of water and sky on day 2, and then on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have water and sky creatures created. And then on the 6th day, we have the creation of land creatures, corresponding with the 3rd day of creation of land. So there's a pattern of 3, and then going back 3, and that is not complete. That's not finished. It's not finished until the 7th day is added, and that 7th day becomes a day of rest, set apart, holy, representing that creation is not complete until God says it's complete, and God rests and gives his blessing. So just in short, that's an example of the way we're reading chapter 1 of Genesis, and what it tells us both about God and also what it sets up in the terms of theme for the rest of the Bible. Chapter 1 in Genesis is the conception of it all. It's where mankind began. In part 2, we'll look at the rest of Genesis, chapter 2 through 50. It's jam-packed because there's a lot of foundation that God lays out in that book. But I look forward to sharing that with you next.